Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us. Today we're going to be talking about biodiversity and why it's important. But before we get started, I wanted to take time to tell you who we are. NEMA. Our mission is preserving the marine environment by promoting sustainable maritime industry best practices and educating the public to save our seas. What does all that mean? Simply put, we are a nonprofit composed of educators, scientists, and industry personnel that believes in bringing together all sides to promote marine literacy and educate the public to save our seas. I'm Ricky McDaniel, one of the education managers at NEMA, and I'm happy to have you join us today. So let's get started. So what is biodiversity? Well, the short definition, the variety of life in the world or within a particular ecosystem. If we break the word down, it might make a little more sense. Bio meaning living and diversity meaning different. So what we're really saying is that we're talking about biodiversity is all the living things within an ecosystem. If you don't know what an ecosystem is, that's okay. Think of it as something like a coral reef or a rainforest. It would be all the living things that depend on each other. Living, remember living includes plants and the creatures in the soil. So back on slide 4, I said the definition of biodiversity was the variety of life in the world or a particular ecosystem. So what does variety mean and why is it so important? Well, let's think about taking a trip to an aquarium or a zoo. What if you arrived and they had 20 different exhibits, but they were all the same animal? That's not variety. That's not very interesting, is it? You expect to see more than one type of animal there, right? So you could learn about many different animals and how they all interact together. If we look at the picture on this slide, I give you a great example of a lot of variety on a coral reef. Coral reefs have some of the highest biodiversity. Remember, biodiversity means all different living things that are there together. There is a healthy balance of fish, corals, turtles, worms, sharks, urchins, just to name a few. If you remove even one of these species, we would see a decrease in the variety of fish, possibly an increase in algae, a decrease in shark or grouper or other predatory fish, a decrease in cleaner fish and shrimp, a decrease in marine worms. So even ocean warming, just slightest amount, could have an effect on all of these. So we just talked about what could happen in a coral reef if oceans warm even the smallest amount. But let's take a look at the picture here. What do you think has happened? Yes, the trees have been chopped down. And in doing so, we've removed the canopy, or the top layer of the trees, from the forest that provides shade for everything underneath it. And by removing the trees, we have decreased the canopy cover, which would increase the amount of sunlight that gets to the soil, right? So it would make the soil drier, and it could decrease the root structures that are underground, and rainfall would have a greater impact. What will happen to the animals that live there? The birds that need the trees for nesting, the worms that lived in the wet soil. Can they relocate? Will this area come back? Will the animals move back in? We have altered or changed this ecosystem in such a way that we have decreased the biodiversity within it. Remembering, biodiversity is everything that was living there. So we're going to take a look at this video clip and then we'll talk about it afterward.
Biodiversity is built out of 3 intertwined features: ecosystem diversity, species diversity, and genetic diversity. The more intertwining there is between these features, the denser and more resilient the weave becomes. Take the Amazon rainforest, one of the most biodiverse regions on Earth due to its complex ecosystems, huge mix of species, and the genetic variety within those species. Here are tangled liana vines, which crawl up from the forest floor to the canopy, intertwining with treetops and growing thick wooded stems that support these towering trees. Helped along by the vines, trees provide the seeds, fruits, and leaves to herbivores such as the tapir and the agouti, which disperse their seeds throughout the forest so they can grow. Leftovers are consumed by the millions of insects that decompose and recycle nutrients to create rich soil. The rainforest is a huge system filled with many smaller systems like this, each packed with interconnected species. Every link provides stability to the next, strengthening biodiversity's weave. That weave is further reinforced by the genetic diversity within individual species, which allows them to cope with changes.
So in the video, it talks about the rainforest and it mentions the vines, the tapir, that was the animal walking through the forest, the seeds and how they are dispersed, the birds and insects that eat the flowers. If any one of these species were removed, endangered, die off, or cut down, we would see this would have an effect on all the species that live in the area because they're all so closely intertwined. They're dependent on each other at some point in their life. So biodiversity is very important. A highly diverse ecosystem is more resilient to change in conditions and can better withstand or adapt to significant disturbances. For example, a panda and a bamboo forest. That's a very sensitive balance. If we remove or chop down the bamboo, what would the panda eat? Those two are highly interconnected. But in a forest, we have worms, birds, beetles, insects, lizards, spiders. And if a virus came through and wiped out some of the worms, the ecosystem would be able to come back because it still has the insects, the spiders, the lizards that can all do or make up for the loss of the worms temporarily. So biodiversity is very important at all levels and in all ecosystems, even at the species and molecular level. I hope you've enjoyed learning about biodiversity and have learned how important it is. Remember that biodiversity just means the variety of all things living together. They all depend on one another in some way.